All right. Well, I'm Pastor Steve Owenby here at Westport Baptist Church, and we want to welcome you to another episode of Westport Talk. I have invited a friend and pastor, friend of mine, Randy Starkey, to come and be with us today. We're going to talk about the SBC and just the annual meeting and just some of the things that have gone on there. I thought that would be really good for our church, and I know that'll bleed over beyond our church, but especially with you, Randy. I mean, you're such a well-known figure in the SBC and everything.
Yeah, I think there's two people who know me.
Well, I actually was watching online and I saw you. I saw your face walking across the screen once. So
okay,
yeah.
So I'm famous now.
Yeah, you are famous now.
Infamous.
But Randy, tell us a little bit about yourself. Just give everybody a little update on what's going on with you. And
Well, I've been a pastor in the SBC for now going on 26 years. So, well, I guess technically my first church I served at as a youth pastor was actually close by here, Cornerstone Church, which at the time was not SBC.
Right.
So that would make it 23 years as pastor
Right.
in the SBC.
Okay.
Most recently, close by here in Stanley, but I resigned my church in September. I have not been pastoring since. For a while, had been engaged with a church in Lake Charles, Louisiana, was about to make the decision to go there, but God changed our direction, and so now we're making some transition in another direction at the moment that's not public yet.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
But knowing a little bit about that, it's pretty exciting.
Yes,
Opportunity
yes.
God has given to you.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, at least as far as I'm concerned. The opportunity that's been opened up to me to serve with a Christian ministry. So, yeah, looking forward to that.
Well, I know that when you shared with me some of the things that were unfolding there, I was just like, wow, how exciting that is. So,
Yeah, it was, when I got the phone call asking me if I would consider coming to work for them, I told people, I said, I was kind of like a kid in a candy store for a little bit there, feeling a little giddy and excited. So, yeah, still excited, but, kind of, it's all kind of sunk in a little bit more now. So,
right.
But we're in transition, and hopefully we'll make that transition probably mid-August.
Okay. Well, hey, let's open up with word prayer and just ask God's blessing on the phone time. Father, thank you, God, for time that we could just meet and talk about some of the issues, just kind of a debrief, really, of our Southern Baptist Convention that took place in Anaheim, I guess, last week. And, Father, I just pray for Randy. I just pray, God, your blessings upon him, upon his family, and as he makes this upcoming transition, and that you would just give him great favor, and, Lord, that you would use him greatly. And we just pray, Lord, that you'll use this podcast today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, Randy, we had a big convention last week, Anaheim, California. I had planned to go myself, and I had planned for the whole year to go, and then started running into complications there toward the end with ticket prices and hotel arrangements and everything. So it kind of made it to be a real challenge to do that. And but yeah, there was a lot going on at the convention. That's why I wanted to be there, and I was really torn about not being there. But we had some issues come up that I know a lot of people that maybe in our churches have heard about some of these things, but they're probably not hearing, good, clear, sound information about this. That it's being filtered through the media and what gets viewers and the sensationalism of it and all. And
Right.
I thought maybe just because of your involvement with the convention and your knowledge of it and all, that maybe we could sit down and just kind of talk about some of this. So what would you say are some of the bigger issues that would be important for us to maybe try to hit on here?
Well, I think probably for everybody who had any awareness of the upcoming annual meeting, that the Sexual Abuse Task Force report was going to be all encompassing of our convention. Surprisingly, it didn't feel that way. I mean, the effects of it most certainly were there. But honestly, I think what kind of eclipsed even that, which most certainly you can't disconnect from everything that's been going on with that whole process, but was the Southern Baptist Convention debating on the floor, what is a pastor?
Yeah.
And I think that probably took first tier place in just a revelation moment with a big question mark about, wow, who would have ever thought that the Southern Baptist Convention would be debating something so that has been so fundamental to who we are since, 91 at the, when we would say we kind of ended or won that whole battle for the Bible in the conservative resurgence. So,
Right.
but yeah, so I think that was overwhelmingly significant there. I mean, not to say that the Sexual Abuse Task Force wasn't important, and it most certainly, but it pretty much, we knew how that was going to go.
Right.
I mean, no matter what your opinions were about that, you kind of knew when those recommendations came that those were going to be accepted. Now, we can talk about this maybe further down the line, but I think the highlight of that moment for me, again, I want to be fair, but for me was when Mark Coppinger took the floor and gave a response to those recommendations and kind of the way it had been placed before us. And I mean, I can't quote him, but he essentially has said, and let's just be honest that this idea that if you don't accept these recommendations as they've been given, that you're somehow
Enabler.
right, you're not for doing anything about sexual abuse. And then he said, or you're unwilling to repent. And then Mark Coppinger just says, and that's just kind of cheesy. I thought that was a pretty good moment in the convention.
Now, who is Mark Coppinger?
Mark Coppinger he's retired currently, but he's served at numerous institutions as a professor of philosophy and ethics. I know he served for a number of years at Southern. I think he was at maybe at Mid America at some point, or Midwestern. I don't know which one. I don't know all his credentials, but I know he's also done some episodes of Wield the Sword for Founders. But just a brilliant man, brilliant theologian as well. So.
Right. Yeah. And a couple of other issues. I know that they probably weren't as they didn't garner as much attention in the media, but we had the whole issue of abortion, a little bit of that.
Yes, that's become an
abolitionist
debate.
Versus
pro-life.
That. And
we divided that issue from all pro-life to pro-life and abolitionist.
And kind of tied into that, there was a motion that was made on the floor, and I was kind of taken back that it made it to the floor, but to defund the ERLC.
Yes, it did get
So
debated.
was
It was the one motion that was made that was actually debated on the floor.
Right.
I mean, all the other motions got referred.
Right.
I think the first session there was like 22 motions made, and the second opportunity there was about 15.
So what made that one different? How did that one manage to get debated? Because I'm sure that the powers that be in the SBC would have preferred that not be voted on.
Yeah, I think just the criteria that they kind of try to measure these motions with, some of those motions get ruled out of order based on bylaws, or it gets very tedious. Some of those get referred to the entities because apparently, and I don't fully understand, I've not read in detail all the bylaws, but that we can't direct an entity. So any motions made about Southeastern or about Southern, and there were some made for about both of those, some made for, I think, Lifeway at one point. Those were referred to those entities, trustees, bodies. So a lot of the motions got referred that way. Other motions were referred back to the EC, the Executive Committee, because of their complexity. And others are just ruled out of order.
And all that just for the average messenger, average pastor, that is the most frustrating part.
It is. Because
good and well when they get referred to those trustees, they're not really going to do anything.
Well, and I think that's a measure of the issues right now, because I understand, and I think many people can understand that the trustees of an entity are there for a purpose, and they should have part in making certain decisions about particular entities. But the issue of the lack of trust today plays a big role in that. So, there's a big question mark about the role that trustees are playing. Trustees are supposed to be, speaking to the entities from the pews,
Yeah, now they're,
but they seem to be speaking for the entities to the pews.
the trustees, I think that many people feel like the trustees have become a tool or a weapon in the hand of the entity leaders themselves.
Yeah, they're somewhat, it seems, and again, now understanding that trustees, that's a group, and we talk about it as a cooperative group, but
Right.
that may not be the case with individuals as you talk about each individual
Right.
trustee. But as a group, it seems that has been apparent, at least in recent days, that the trustees are just defending the entities
Yeah,
rather than
yeah.
holding them accountable.
Well, and to refer things to say, well, this is out of order because that needs to be addressed with the trustees. Basically, it comes across as if the messengers are working for the trustees rather than the trustees there for the messengers.
Right.
And when you go to your annual meeting, that ought to be something that can be addressed.
And that was, excuse me, that was a question that got raised, and it was frustrating because once it got raised, there wasn't really a clear explanation given about why certain motions were getting referred back to those trustees. And the question on the floor was basically, so if we, the messengers, as we've been told, own the entities, how do we get something done, without it just going back to the trustees? How do we do that? And of course, the answer to that was, well, you can make a motion for that to be pulled back out, but it's not debatable. It must be voted on by the body, and it requires a 2/3 vote to get that pulled back out, as opposed to being referred back to trustees. And they attempted that at one point, and they couldn't get the vote on the floor, which, it seemed that there was really probably 2/3 of those present at the convention that kind of represented one perspective largely. Again, it's more complex than that, but largely as in the 2/3 that ended up voting down the defunding of the ERLC, or I'm sorry, not the defunding, but the abolishing.
Abolishment.
And that's two different things, to vote for abolishing them versus voting to defund them. And I've just learned that I assume the language was just the same thing, but that there is a difference between that. And I don't know if it had been any different if we had made the motion to defund them, because to defund them wouldn't eliminate them. It would just make them kind of like Lifeway and Guidestone, where they don't receive CP dollars.
Right.
So, but the motion was to abolish them.
Right.
And 2/3 of the, they could not get a 2/3 vote, clearly. So, but to give you one example on the trustees thing, there was an issue, we won't go into the details of it, about an investigation at Southeastern concerning Tom and Jennifer Buck. And something that had been done to Jennifer Buck concerning a personal draft that got released. And there was conversations with Southeastern between them. And essentially, Southeastern basically said, we've done an internal investigation, and, some anonymous people have come forward and said that they were the ones behind it. Nobody knows who they are, but case closed. So it was motion.
Not even the trustees
Right.
or the president of Southeastern know.
Right. And it was motion on the floor to have an investigation of that, but that one was basically not brought out for debate because it was directing an entity, and so it was referred back to the trustees of the entities.
Right.
And ironically, one of the trustees of Southeastern is Ed Litton. And so I think there's a conflict of interest going on here, because you can't remove the
Ed
political aspects.
Ed Litton is pointing to the EC and say, you can't investigate yourself.
Right.
And yet he's on a board that's saying, we will investigate ourselves.
Right. And so they pretty much shut that down. And there were a lot of people who felt like there was unfair treatment in that particular case, because every time it was brought up on the floor, to allow for debating on that particular issue. I know Michelle Leslie from Woodlawn Baptist Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, made the motion. And in the motion, she mentioned Jennifer Buck's name, and she was interrupted and told from the platform that she could not mention a name. Tom Buck later, on behalf of her as well, spoke up, and he mentioned his own wife's name. He was interrupted as well, told the same. But then somebody challenged that at the end on the resolutions, because 2 resolutions had a list of names in them. And so I don't think they were really trying to get the names removed. I think they were trying to make a point when they called a point of order on that and asked the chair to waive his position on that, because he'd been stating for so long that for multiple times that you can't mention a name from the floor. But then some clarity was brought to that, which was interesting because the parliamentarian Barry McCarty came up and explained to us that the Robert's Rules of Order it discourages that kind of thing about mentioning somebody personal or a church personally in a disparaging way, and so for that reason but in a disparaging way. None of those other times was a name mentioned in a disparaging way.
Nope.
So it was.
I don't think Tom Buck was speaking of his wife in a disparaging way.
The point was not well taken at that point of order was not well taken because the list of names in the resolutions were not being spoken of disparagingly. But at the same time, there was multiple interruptions along the way because of the mention of a name, even though it wasn't disparaging. So I think there was a little discrepancy there. Yeah. I mean, they also explained to us, or Barry did as well, tried to explain to us that, in reference to that no one under the Robert's Rules of Order had been treated unfairly. Yeah. I mean, that's up to your personal opinion, whether or not you see it that way, but that was what was stated to us from the platform. So,
and the other issue, which we're going to try to hit some of these here a little bit more in depth, but the other one was the election.
Sure.
We had the privilege of having Dr. Tom Askell here at Westport a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And that was a real honor, and I really appreciate the fact that here he is. He's going to be voted on for president a little over a week after he was here, and not once did he, in his time at the pulpit, mention anything about his.
Right, he was not campaigning.
He was not campaigning at all.
Contrary
I really
to
appreciated that.
Contrary to many opinions about that concept of campaigning, you can split the hairs on that, whether Tom was campaigning at any time or whether he was just making himself available for people to get to know who he was and what he stood for. If you call that campaigning, okay, but I think the intent is different.
Well, he didn't force himself in any churches either.
No.
Yeah. So the election didn't quite go the way we had hoped it would. And there might be some, logistical reasons for that with the location of the convention and so forth. But why don't we come back? I think one of the biggest issues that just to make sure we have the time that we need. I think one of the biggest issues is this sexual abuse task force.
Yes.
And there was one former Southern Baptist, and we do not have a problem mentioning names here. We're not under the Robert's Rules of Order for the Southern Baptist Convention. So Russell Moore.
Yes.
Full disclosure, I'm not a fan. But Russell Moore, he when the Guidepost report, and let me just explain real quickly what we're looking at here. You've probably heard that there were some accusations that there was a cover-up of pastors and maybe other church leaders who had committed sexual abuse, and that has happened. That sexual abuse has happened in some of the churches and a few times in some of our entities, our seminaries and so forth. And there was a move last year at the convention to form a task force that would look into this. Well, that task force was put together by the new president, Ed Litton, and the task force, the sexual abuse task force, hired an outside agency that apparently has had a lot of experience working with corporations and sexual abuse issues. And the name of that organization was Guidepost. And Guidepost came back with a recommendation from their research and their interviews and so forth. And when that report came out just a few weeks before the convention, which that wasn't a surprise. I mean, everybody expected that was going to happen because it needed to be addressed at the convention this year. But when that report did come out, Russell Moore, who now I'm drawing a blank on who he works with now.
Christianity Today.
Yeah. He stated that report for the SBC was apocalyptic.
Yes.
You think that's fair?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sensational language because, number one, there was the only thing that was listed in that report that we did not have prior knowledge of was the issues surrounding Johnny Hunt.
Right.
Outside of that, I mean, maybe not the average person who wasn't following, but I can tell you right now that from public knowledge, I had knowledge of everything that was in that report.
Right.
Almost to many specifics, not a few I didn't put necessarily names of witnesses, but I didn't necessarily know that this particular person had spoken in support of this or that, but there was nothing new.
Yeah. So there were probably about 3 or 4 things related to that I think that would be worth us taking a moment to talk about. And I would say this: if you want to read a good analysis, in my opinion, of that, Megan Basham, who writes for Daily Wire, she had an article on that, and I did not write down the name of that article, but shoot, I meant
You
to.
can put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, we could do that. We'll put a link in there. But one little quote from that I think is really important. She stated in her article there are about 100,000 to 150,000 staffers in SBC churches, but many thousands more volunteer in their ministries, and I would say that would at least double or triple that number.
Yeah.
Of all the allegations that Guidepost investigators reviewed, they found only 2 that appear to involve current SBC workers. Well, that was the whole issue, that these things were not being addressed, and that a pastor or a staff person is abusing someone in this church, and that church is letting that go unaddressed, and then they go over to another church and they've got freedom to start all over again.
Yes.
Well, 2 cases that Guidepost could find. Now, there may be more, but they were investigating this.
Well, yeah,
They found 2.
and I'd go back to say, one of the things that Mark Coppinger said on the floor was that, now you can say, he basically highlighted what you were just talking about, that out of the Houston Chronicle report, this was kind of the outcome, what we know of in numbers. And he said, of course, we do keep numbers. We talk about how many missionaries we send, how many conversions there were, and crossover. So here's the numbers. And he said, you can say this is just the tip of the iceberg, but the burden of proof is upon you.
Right.
I mean, we can say that. Now, that's not to say one's too many. I mean, we'd all agree one is
That's
too
right.
many, but to title this apocalyptic based on these findings, I think it's just, it's the culture, impacting how we think we should be responding to something like this. Back in 2017, and my dates might not be right, but I remember when things kind of started in the secular world. I think there was a radio personality up north that was kind of the first one. And then Matt Lauer at the ABC or whatever that got kind of canned. I remember saying to a friend of mine then that, it's open season on men. And then when Houston Chronicle released their article, and it was a several part article on the SBC, it was like we just jumped down this hole that I don't know that we'll ever see the light of day from again. Whatever has taken place in the secular culture, we have just followed suit. Right. And we're seeing that happening right now in the SBC. Instead of us impacting the culture, I think the culture is having a huge impact on how we are saying we need to respond in this way. Mm-hmm.
So, and just for clarification, as a pastor yourself and as a pastor here at Westport, if we had a situation that arose where we had a staff person or a volunteer leader that sexually abused a minor, we'll just say that, not even an adult, but a minor. Mm-hmm. And this would be true for an adult as well, but my first step is not going to be to call up the SBC and right. say, hey, you need to investigate it. No, I'm going, if it's a minor, I'm going to report it myself to the police. But if it's an adult, I'm going to say, you need to go report this to the police.
Well, yeah. And
is that
absolutely. I mean, the first thing, obviously, I love the way Tom Askell addressed it in, many times leading up to the convention was, we each have lanes. God has given certain authorities in certain spheres. Right. He's given the sword to the magistrate. He's given the keys to the church, and he's given the rod to the family. And so, as far as the church and the government is concerned, when a crime is committed, we call the authorities. Right. We let them address crimes.
That doesn't mean the church doesn't address
that. No,
that.
we had to church it from the church
because
perspective.
There's some things that
there should be discipline.
There's some things that the police and the government in that sphere that would say, well, you have broken no law.
Right.
But as a church, we would say, well, whether you've broken a law or not, it is a sin, and we've got to address
Right.
that.
There's some crimes that are sins, some sins that are crimes, and
Yeah.
vice versa. So, I mean, some sins that aren't crimes. But either way, if you have a crime in that situation, then we would address it with the secular authorities to
Right.
investigate that, because we're not investigators. We're not trained that way.
So
And then
with
we would
that,
discipline that, though, as a church.
with that statement you just made, does the EC, the
No.
executive
I
committee,
can answer for you. Even
have
ask
the
it.
have the
No.
means and the resources to do what really is being pushed upon them that
No.
we expect you to do this?
Well, no,
And do they have the ability to go investigate? Do they have the resources, the knowledge?
well, they don't even have the
and
right
reason?
in our polity.
Well, that's a third. Yeah.
So, but that's the problem with this idea of cover up that's been presented here. I mean, I can't say whether an individual.
So polity wise though, just for the record, we are autonomous churches.
Autonomous churches.
The SBC has no authority whatsoever
We
over
use
this
we
church.
use the terminology of the Southern Baptist denomination.
It's really
because
not.
that's common,
It's
but
not.
obviously it's not. And we've reached a day where the distinction there has to be clarified. We are all autonomous, independent churches. There was a church in this area recently as a response to what happened at the convention that wanted to clarify, and they said, in response to these kinds of things, we are not Southern Baptist. We are an autonomous, self-governing church. And my response is, and so is every Southern Baptist Convention affiliated church.
Exactly.
Autonomous, self-governing, under no authority beyond that congregation.
Right.
So, but this idea of cover-up, that's been a big issue for me, because again, I can't say whether an individual actually was covering up here or there, but just by the sheer data that we're dealing with, by the time any of these things reached the executive committee, they were public knowledge.
Yeah.
So by that definition, they can't be considered cover-up.
So just along those lines, and this was something I got really interested in reading about, but they had there was a database that was being kept by a staff member with the executive committee, the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, and they had over 400 names of reported sexual abuse incidents. Well, what's the word, JB? What word am I looking for there? Examples of 400 events where sexual abuse had taken place. For one thing, that was I think over a 20-year period.
Mm-hmm.
But those 400 names, the media and some that even within our convention have tried to portray it like it was a cover-up. Well, those names,
Google search.
they had gotten those off of the internet where they had searched out SBC, sexual abuse, and so forth. So many of those people, many of them were in prison. Some of them had been convicted and arrested. There was no cover-up. They were just gathering information. Now, granted, there have been a few cases where there have been some cover-ups. I think even maybe with a few events in our convention with some of the entities, but that's separate than our churches. And there ought to be some oversight, I think, with our entities. Would you agree?
Yes.
But when it comes to our churches, SBC has no authority over that.
Nope.
No authority whatsoever. So somebody might say, well, but we need a method so that we don't have one SBC pastor committing a crime in this church,
Going to another church.
and it's not being reported. He's going to another church. Well, guess what? We do background checks. And I can't imagine any church that would not want to do a background check on someone before they call that person to come to their church. And that background check is probably, as a matter of fact, there's a federal registry for sexual offenders that anyone can have
And it's
access
linked
to.
on the SBC site.
But yes, and it's linked on the SBC site. But why is it that something that we need a separate registry with the SBC when all these other resources are there? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there is an effective way that we can do this. That list that was being generated has been used or weaponized in a sense over against those who have been asking for a database for years. And it's not that people have been like, no, we don't want to, put out their sexual predators. The difficulty has been, how do we do this, and we do it in a way that's right, that doesn't create a bunch of false allegations. And again, people could say it's just all about money. Well, but listen, the executive committee, and this is a point that matters to me, is that, as Southern Baptists, we are affiliated based on the pooling of money.
Right.
The executive committee's primary responsibility is to steward that money. So to say that somehow for them to be concerned about money is just somehow just awful is disingenuous at least. I mean, they have to go, what's the liability here versus, because we're talking about the pooled resources of 47,000 plus churches. But that list, I mean, they've been asking the questions for years. Is there a way to do this that would be effective? And I don't think anybody's unwilling to have that conversation. I think now we've just been catapulted, and that list that was being kept, I doubt there was ill intent in those things. That is being used over against that ideal of creating lists. Now, just interesting.
And that's 400 names, just for some perspective.
And they're not all
here.
Southern Baptist.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
On that list,
okay.
You can see on that list that was released that, some of them were not Southern Baptist.
The majority were, right?
Yeah, I think the majority were, but there were quite a few names on there that were not.
But put that in the context of 20 years, 47,000 plus Southern Baptist
I think
churches.
someone said in the convention there's probably been, like, in that time period, over 28 million Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah. So, I mean, when you start comparing that to corporations in our society, and I'm not justifying it. I'm not trying to justify it and say, hey, it's all right that this happened. I'm not. But going back to this word apocalyptic, this is not apocalyptic.
It's sensational. But what I wanted to share with you is something I thought about just recently. Going back to 2015, there was a watch blog, the Wartburg Watch, and many of those in serving the Southern Baptists are aware of them because they started, I think, around 2008 as a result of a sexual abuse situation that took place at a church in the Raleigh area of North Carolina, and they were seeking to call out an attention to sexual abuse in the church, which is a fine thing to do, but in the process they somehow correlated the fact that complementarian Calvinists are the cause of this kind of thing, which, today even the authoritarian aspects is the breeding ground for sexual abuse. But they did that for years. And I know of this because one of the writers ended up in a church that I pastored. And eventually they came after me because I was a complementarian Calvinist. And so therefore the correlation was, here you have potential for sexual abuse situations. But one of the things that they argued regularly for, I don't know if they still do, I don't read the blog, but they would readily argue for people to never sign a church covenant, and that you are free to leave a church if you want to, that they can't do anything about it. But here's what's interesting. Now we're saying, in light of sexual abuse, that we want to track people leaving a church and going to another church. Well, the way you do that is to have meaningful membership, and that when somebody departs from a church, you don't just let them go, you pursue them, and then if they refuse to return, if they're in unrepentant sin, then you would make other churches aware of that. That's fundamental biblical church membership, church discipline. Right. But I just find it ironic that this same group that's they drove for this list for years, to create a list, but at the same time, they're arguing, hey, if you want to leave a church, that church can't have any say about it. If they try to pursue you, you ought to get involved legally with that church. But it would be necessary for us. Biblical church discipline would eliminate this. So I say all that to say, I'm not opposed to us trying to ask the questions, what can we do as a convention to encourage, to motivate, to resource churches to prevent sexual abuse, whether that be of a minor or even amongst adults. I don't know anybody who would be against doing anything we could to prevent that. What I am opposed to is that we're jumping from A to Z. We're wanting to just talk about, hey, what can we recommend to make it feel like or look like we're actually doing something about this when we're not addressing the primary issue? I would argue that if we really wanted to address sexual abuse or any sin in the church, that the convention could serve churches well by doing the same things that they do for like Hoosier One or for Vacation Bible School with biblical church membership, regenerate church membership, and biblical church discipline. If they would resource churches about these things, that would do a great deal to reduce that. And I say that because as a pastor in small town churches, when I'm addressing biblical church discipline in a church, my people look at me like I have two heads, because most of the people in the pews in small churches have never seen church discipline at work. And so to have the voice of the convention behind you on what it means. I mean, my last church, when I started talking about meaningful membership, and I had people leave. And because, I mean, this was somehow too harsh to take concern about letting people into the membership of the church. And then eventually, through walking through church discipline scenarios, it just became very, very difficult for the church. They'd never seen it done. This was one pastor saying, this is what we should do.
You pastors before you ever done this.
Right. So if we had the voice of the convention behind us, putting out resources and materials, then then my voice about biblical church membership and discipline would be supported by all these, for lack of better terms, these celebrity pastor types in our entities, the Kevin Azels, the Paul Chitwoods, the J.D. Greers, the Johnny Hunts used to be. You know, these guys, their voices would give legitimacy to what I'm trying to teach my church. That would make a difference. Now, if we were doing that, and then on top of that, trying to say, well, what else can we practically do? If the practical responses flow out of the biblical responses, then I could be on board. But I just can't be on board if it's just skipping all that and just talking about, you know, a list. Or what was recommendation one? My mind's going blank. The first recommendation from the Sexual Abuse Task Force. The second one was the ministry safe or ministry check or whatever that list was going to be called. But nevertheless, I could be on board maybe a little bit more with those things if they were dealing with the foundation.
So the previous executive committee that came under such fire because they were accused of trying to cover up and so forth, looking at it from their perspective, they were trying to avoid lawsuits. Again, it gets back to they were not equipped.
In part.
They were not equipped to do an investigation. So if they hear that so-and-so person, for example, the one professor at Southern Seminary that was accused of being a sexual abuser, they were in a situation where the Southern Baptist newspaper, the Baptist Press, had an article, and they had identified him as an abuser, and the executive committee asked them to change that, and their concern was legally because nothing had ever been done to confirm that he was an abuser. No trial, nothing.
The confirmation was that the victim had gone to her supervisor, and her supervisor had arranged a meeting with the president of Southern Seminary, and the two of them believed her. Which, I mean, I'm not trying to discount that. I'm just saying, but that on that basis alone, this accusation became credible because they believed her.
And again, this was a 26-year-old female at one of our seminaries that accused a professor of abusing her
For 12 years.
For 12 years, and she had even moved away and would still go back to the city there where he was and visit with their family, and this so-called abuse continued. Now, it was wrong what that professor did. It was wrong what she did if it was consensual.
Which she argues it was not.
She says it was not consensual, and yet people that knew that professor said that their observation of the situation, it certainly did not look like anything was being forced on her. And the Guidepost report that came out identified him as a
sexual abuser.
They didn't even interview him.
And I think at one point, I don't know if it was actually in the report, but I know it's been stated that it was violent abuse.
Yeah, and so they did not even interview him. They did not interview people that he knew.
Right.
There's been no trial. No church investigation, no seminary investigation.
Well, the report itself is tantamount to the opening statement of a prosecution. That's it.
Right.
That's what this report is. The opening statement of prosecution, and we've ended it there. There's no deliberation. There's no trial. There's no consideration of a jury of peers, kind of for sake of a legal example. It's just the opening statement.
So am I accurate in? I read through a lot of the Guidepost report. Am I accurate in my what I think is my understanding that they were recommending the Guidepost report that credible accusations against someone would qualify them to go on this list?
Yes. And
what is a credible accusation?
Well, they've tried to define that to some extent. And again, I've not followed through with trying to gain complete understanding, but I know that it was stated even at the convention. Bruce Frank had tried to give explanation to it. But again, there's so much data here, it's hard to digest it all. But I know it. I think they have said that either a criminal conviction, a civil suit against somebody, or that they had confessed under counsel or something, even if there's not a criminal aspect to it.
Okay.
Now, if that's the limitation there, then maybe that is sufficient. I don't know. I don't know about the confessing in under counsel, what that looks like on the legal aspect, but I don't know if that would go any further. But I know they tried to lay out some of those guidelines.
But I think the previous executive committee that was under such fire for supposedly covering up, I think that that one of their big concerns again was the litigation that they might expose themselves to.
Yes,
by
and the possible nature of us establishing or affecting our polity in such a way that there would be any reasonable argument for ascending or descending liability.
Yeah.
Which means if there's an establishment of that, which that goes into even another issue that the ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, had filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court that stated in some way or another that kind of implied that there was a hierarchy to our system. That was withdrawn, but it's on record.
Not only was it withdrawn, but our friend Russell Moore admitted to the executive committee that was false information.
Yes, but
he had signed.
It was still filed, which puts it on record. And so the concern about the ascending and descending liability issues is that if a church in Texas is egregiously handles a sexual abuse situation, and does seek to cover it up, that then not only would that church be liable, but the rest of the 47,000 plus churches in the convention could be held.
That's not a. That's a concern.
It's a concern, but it's not like a front door concern.
It's not like someone saying this is going to happen that way.
Right. There's a lot of ground to cover
between
between
them. I think the minute the SBC starts telling our churches that you've got to provide this information now, you've got to do this, agree to do this
in order to be in friendly cooperation.
Yeah, that's the moment that we see a mass exodus of Southern Baptist churches.
Yeah, and I mean, that's each church has to make that decision for themselves, and I have my opinion right now that I wish churches would hold off for a bit.
Well, and that's my posture. And, I'm inclined to think that maybe a good option is to what money we are generally giving to the cooperative program. Maybe a good option is to designate that toward a particular area, such as the International Mission for Lottie Moon. Even.
Yeah, I know a lot of churches that are designated to Lottie Moon, and then of course I encourage if there's question there financially whether or not you want to be contributing money to all these other things that you really didn't sign on for, then give the Lottie Moon for now to maintain your voice and support that work. Or maybe increase your giving to your local association.
Right.
I definitely think the future of the Southern Baptist is grounded in local association, where we can actually sit down across the table from one another and have conversations and hold accountable to what we say we cooperate around, and that being right now the Baptist faith and message.
Right.
Which even in itself is being questioned.
Right. Yeah. And. But I think the advantage to giving to something like Lottie Moon, that allows you to continue to send messengers to the convention. Whereas if you designate all that to your association, then
So because every church that contributes to an entity or the cooperative program or Lottie Moon gets 2 messengers, and then they get 1 additional messenger for every percentage of undesignated receipts that they do give. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. Okay. So you brought up about the Baptist faith message there, and this might be kind of a good note for us to kind of end on here. But the whole issue came up. Women as pastors, the resolutions committee made a recommendation.
Credentials committee.
You're right. Credentials committee made a resolution to ask that the new president coming in would appoint a committee, so to speak, I
Study
guess,
committee.
to determine what is a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
That did not, and you hear that, and I think our people in our pews, they hear that, and they think, where is our convention going? Well, what you don't hear from those news reports is that was overwhelmingly defeated by the messengers.
Yes, it is interesting the way it played out, though. And the defeat was good, but it was also had a negative outcome as well. Because last year at the 2021 convention in Nashville, a motion was brought to disfellowship Saddleback Church. That was
Right.
surrounding. Now, Saddleback is not the only church. I mean,
That's Rick Warren's church, by the
right?
way.
And you can see there's a whole list of Southern Baptist churches that have, husband, wife, teen pastor. So the woman's a teaching pastor as well. This is just like the highest profile one. Plus, they came out publicly celebrating the ordaining of 3 women.
They shot across the bow.
Yes. So the motion was made last year, and that was referred to the Credentials Committee, which was established for considering whether a church is in, as our Constitution says, close association, or not close, a friendly association, because they closely align with the Baptist faith and message. So when it came back this year, the Credential Committee brought a recommendation that we form that study team to determine the meaning of pastor in the Baptist faith and message, where it says that the office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. That one was interesting, because what happened when that came on the floor, that recommendation, probably a highlight moment was Dr. Al Mohler from Southern.
I was extremely pleased with the way that he spoke.
Stood up and he basically he said, the question on the table was, we don't know what was intended by the meeting. Well, Dr. Mohler was on the committee that brought the Baptist message in 2000, and he said they used the word pastor then because it was the most readily understood term amongst Southern Baptists. We use the term pastor. We don't use elder, generally speaking. Some do, but for years, pastor has been the term that we have chosen to use that implies the meaning of the office and function of elder, bishop, overseer.
And in my seminary training, that was 3 synonymous terms that identified maybe some different functions within that office, but you had elder, bishop, and pastor.
And elder would be, in my opinion, elder is the best term for the office, and then what they do is they oversee and they shepherd or pastor of the flock. But nevertheless, Dr. Mohler said, if we have to form a study committee to determine the meaning of the words of the Baptist faith and message, then we are doomed and are no longer confessional people. Now, that's almost a quote. And the point was, he had been on that committee, and they knew what it meant. And it means today what it meant in the year 2000, when that was overwhelmingly adopted by Southern Baptists.
Well, and the twist that's being attempted is to say that, well, we're not talking about the office. We're talking about the giftedness. This is that gift.
Along with, they inserted the word from the recommendation that it meant lead pastor.
Right.
And that's just been a conversation that's recently come up. I know I've heard it from Dwight McKissick often in debate over this issue, that's the lead pastor, which would open up any other pastor in the church to be a woman. But and then the question was the office of pastor versus the gift of pastor. And of course, they're referring to Ephesians 4 there, when Jesus rose from the dead, and it says he gifted to the church, and then it gives a list, and pastor and shepherd is amongst those. But the one thing I would highlight there is that the gift given to the church is the pastor shepherd, not a gift given to an individual, but rather these are the gifts to the church. And so I think that's a wrong use of that passage. But that would be the only passage if somebody could derive the idea of the gift of pastor apart from the office. I think they're one and the same. God gifts people with what's necessary, the gift of pastor shepherd, in order to fulfill the office and function of pastor shepherd. And so that was, that concept of putting in that word lead pastor, I think was, I'd like to say an oversight, but it probably wasn't an oversight. It was just, it's the terminology of the day. We're changing the language in order to change the meaning. And I think this flows out of everything we've seen happening from the Church 2 movement with the sexual abuse and the ideal of abusing or
The world is
oppressing
watching.
women.
We got to be careful.
Yeah, and so now this affects
And
the
I
conversation.
say that tongue in cheek, just so everyone knows.
Right.
But that's the mantra of some, that they're. I think they're more concerned about what the world thinks than what
Right.
God's word says.
So Dr. Moeller encouraged on the floor that we would defeat this recommendation. But after Dr. Moeller, Dr. Adam Greenway from Southwestern came forward and offered an amendment. Now, the amendment changed the focus of the study team to, instead of studying the meaning of pastor, to study the concept of what it means to be closely aligned, which would, I don't know what his intentions were, and I think that study probably needs to be done, but this wasn't the place for that to be focused on. But ultimately, we had to do a ballot vote over the amendment that he offered. That failed, and then we voted on the or actually, we didn't vote on the recommendation. When that amendment failed, the floor was given to Rick Warren at that point in time.
Rick Warren,
who gave
a
6.5 minute.
Which the Credentials Committee last year was charged with investigating Saddleback Community Church because they had ordained.
Proper terms, inquiring, because we can't investigate.
Okay,
but inquiring
to see if they qualified to be
disfellowship,
send messengers and maybe disfellowship. So he spoke and basically said, "Hey, this is a secondary issue." And
with not only that,
and by the way, he trained you as a pastor, right?
Well, there's a couple things I could say about that. But the things that he said, I mean, yes, obviously that
he claimed that he has trained more pastors than our seminaries have trained, 1.1 million. Yeah.
But the problem is that was apples to oranges, because he came out on Twitter afterwards and gave explanation of that, about how he had trained people who trained people who trained people who trained people. Well, on that basis, the seminary trains people who goes out and trains people and trains people and trains people. So
and why not draw attention to the people who trained him instead of to himself?
Yes, but so that was a secondary issue. We need to keep the main thing. That
according to Rick Warren,
right? To make God smile. That was the one thing. But the other thing that I thought was interesting on the floor, understanding that historically, while I know there's a great deal of debate in the Southern Baptists amongst some about the issues of Calvinism and traditionalism, and we have both in our convention, and our umbrella is wide enough for both. But historically, since the beginning of Southern Baptists, we have had both in our convention. But he stated on the floor, he said, brothers and sisters, we have brothers here today who don't believe that Jesus died for the whole world, and we make room for them. So that was a statement about Calvinists. Number one, I don't think that was a fair way to state it, because
although Rick Warren at times has identified himself as a Calvinist.
Well, that I didn't know, but 1 John chapter 2 says, that Jesus was propitiation not only for our sins, but for the sins of the whole world. And we as Calvinists, I'm a Calvinist, believe that to be true. We just define that a little bit differently. We would say that he died for the whole world, not without exception, but without distinction. So for him to even make that statement was a little bit disingenuous, because I believe as a Calvinist that Jesus died for the whole world, for all peoples, without distinction. But the point here is that he tried to put the fact that we have Calvinists in the convention on same par as having people who are ordaining women in the convention, and that should be equal. Just because we accept this group, we should accept this group. Right. And again, apples to oranges, as far as our convention is concerned. So once he spoke, then the Credentials Committee withdrew the recommendation for the study group. And what that essentially meant is we made it nowhere, because now that motion from last year goes right back into the Credentials Committee until they are prepared. That's the specific wording given to us. Until they are prepared to make recommendations. We could not pull that out to the floor to actually have a vote on it right now.
Well, they have in my opinion, they have no interest in dealing with this issue.
No, I don't think I personally don't think there'll be a recommendation to disfellowship.
Or any of the others, because there's a number of other churches that...
Sure.
I mean, I think it's a small percentage overall. But
sure.
but that's part of the problem. I mean, we have 47,000 plus churches, and we had 10,000 messengers representing what, 5,000?
No, we have roughly around 8,500 messengers, representing 3,075 churches in the convention.
3,000 of 47,000.
Yeah.
And I've just got to believe that the majority of those churches.
Well, and I think the
that,
presidential election gave us a real glimpse of that, because last year in Nashville, which was the first year we attempted to really rally the grassroots Baptist
Right.
to come out to the convention, and we saw 15,000
It's unfortunate
messengers.
there was in Anaheim this year.
Yes, and we saw a 52 to 48 vote in the presidents. This year, we tried to rally grassroots,
60-40
everyday pastors, and it was 60-40 split. But I think that was largely because it was in Anaheim. So next year it's in New Orleans, June 13th, 14th. I know. Moved from Charlotte to New Orleans. Again, no political intent in that move.
Accommodations.
Right, accommodations, because we are having more. But I think we can see 15,000 plus messengers next year. We're going to have to get some new ones that haven't come to show up, because we've having so many churches leave the convention. So, I mean, like in January, Praise Mills in the Atlanta area, they pulled out, and I would only guess that they probably would have been eligible for 12 messengers and probably would have brought 12 messengers. So we lost that.
Right.
So we've got to have folks who haven't been involved before saying, hey, this is important for the direction of the SBC, and we want to have a voice, so let's show up.
Yeah.
And I encourage churches strongly to find a way even now to start planning to be able to send, at least a messenger, if not your full number of messengers to New Orleans. And even if that means you have to take back some of your cooperative program dollars and set it aside for the expenses of your messengers. I think that would be a worthy thing, because not only is committing finances one way in which we cooperate, but committing our voices is important too to the future. So right now, I think where the question on the table in general, leading up to this for the last couple of years, is there a liberal drift in the Southern Baptist Convention? Now, again, notice the phrasing. Is there a liberal drift? That's different than saying this person's a liberal.
Right.
We're merely saying, is there a movement trajectory? I don't think you can deny that, although I know Danny Aiken says that's I can't remember the term he used, but it's just basically insane to say that, absurd, or but it's
So,
obvious. We're debating what a pastor means on the floor.
Yeah, Randy, I think it's worth stating that while I would not have voted for Bart Barber. I don't think he is a liberal. I think that he would embrace all of the things pretty much that we would. He might be a little. I don't know. He might be a little waffly on this pastor thing, women pastor thing. I'm not sure. But he was on the credentials committee.
No, he was on the resolution committee.
The resolution committee.
Yes.
Okay.
He was on the resolution committee. He was the chair of the resolution committee.
Okay.
He served on it this year and previous year.
So I'm not sure where he stands on that. But
he said he's a
but if we had him come speak in our
complementarian.
churches, and he spoke his convictions, I don't think he would say anything that would hair lip any of our people. But it's the fact that and I think part of it goes to this: the world is watching.
We heard that several times in this convention as well.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. But that whole concern, where we're more concerned about what does the world think than we are about what does God's word say.
Well, and this comes down to a practical philosophy of our mission, and I understand. I'm a generous person. I want to be liked.
Yeah.
But the philosophy that's divided is that if we're going to win the world to Christ, then either we've got to be winsome and we've got to capitulate so that they see us as helpful and servants and nice, or there's this idea that, if we just stick to the book and do it God's way, God will take care of this. We need to be, obviously, in our methodology, we need to be gracious and kind, but we need to be firm. So that's really where the division is in how we should move forward. And the ideal world's watching, and we need to make sure what we do is done in such a way that the world isn't, intrinsically offended. Versus the ones who says, "No, we're just going to."
And the gospel is offensive. It put our Savior on the cross.
Yeah. We're going to be faithful to the book as best we can. We're going to be honest. We're going to seek to do so in a way that is gracious and biblically kind, but without compromising the fear of God.
Right.
That we're going to live in accordance to what the Bible tells us, trusting that our living and pursuing righteousness, regardless of where the world is, will be the means that God will use to change their hearts and minds. Yeah. We are supposed to, in our approach, to be convincing people of the truth of the gospel, but we can't literally convince them. Only God can change their heart and open their eyes to the truth.
And that's not just at the SBC level, that is the local church level, and that is the individual level.
Absolutely.
We had a situation this week where I had posted on social media about the new Disney movie where
The
Buzz
red
Lightyear or whatever,
that one.
they have two, I think it's two women, I don't know, maybe it's two men, but they had a same-sex couple kissing. It's a movie targeted for children. So I had posted on there. I thought that actually Denny Burke, a professor up at Southern Seminary, had said that we got to be careful. The world's trying to catechize our children.
Yes, they are.
And I said, you as parents, you need to be aware that the world is trying to shape the biblical world or the worldview of your children, and this is the way they do it. Mm-hmm. So I had put that on there. Well, we have a ministry, a particular ministry here in our church for children, and a parent who is not in our church, they're in another church here in the community, but they had their children involved in that ministry here, and it was polite, but they sent back a message and said, "I am very sorry to hear you feel this way. Our children will no longer be involved in that ministry at your church."
Wow.
Yeah. So, but you know what? And I'm not mad at that person. Man, I would love to sit down and have a conversation with them.
Sure.
I'd love to ask them, so what's the basis
Why does
for
this
your
bother
belief?
you so bad?
Yeah, why do you believe that? What makes you think that what I said is wrong and what you said is right? Help me understand that. Because there is no basis. It's just popular opinion. But that's what we are facing. And we have to decide, okay, do I want these people to like me? Or am I going to speak the truth? Do I care more about what they think or what God thinks? Yeah. I think that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, and that's the thing about it. We just, as it's been said by several in recent days, we breathe the same air.
Yeah.
And so, the think that the culture is not going to have an impact on us is naive at best. And so we've got to constantly be looking at the guardrails that we're putting up to protect ourselves, our churches, our convention from the effects of the culture, because it's going to have an effect on us. And if we don't dig our feet down into the dirt and stand fast, we're going to move. And see, that's not an indictment against any individual in our convention, any entity leader or anything, but reality is we will drift if we don't put down these stakes. And I feel like we're unwilling in today's culture to put down stakes because the world is watching, and we don't want them to misinterpret what we're doing as somehow, pharisaical, pious in the negative sense. And my response is simply, regardless of that, man, I'm like you. I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody, but apart from that, I'm putting down the stakes because I know I can move. I know the world will have an effect on me. Right. And I have to battle that every single day and pray for discernment and the wisdom of the Spirit to move in my heart and life to make sure I'm viewing things rightly. And I know guys like Bart Barber are not any different. I know they have the same desire, and I agree with you. I think it was stated by somebody, I was reading an article this morning, that Bart Barber is the best Southern Baptist president that we've had since 2018. Okay? So, and I think Bart will do a fine job trying to be fair. Now, I think he's definitely going to fall to the establishment side because they're going to have more influence on him than me as a podunk pastor from somewhere else. But nevertheless, I think he will intend to do so. And I just happen to think that Bart Barber's presidency, while it won't overtly be negative, maybe I hope not like the last one, and have some kind of sensational accusations to be able to throw at Bart, but I think his middle of the road approach of unity is actually going to bring about a greater amount of damage to the SBC. I think it's going to help us to put our guards down. And so I've said many times that Bart Barber is probably the most down-to-earth guy I've ever seen nominated for the presidency.
He's a farmer. He's
a guy I feel like I have to go hang out with.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I've said he'd probably make a great president in 4 years after we've dealt with this. I think we needed someone who was more willing to principally stand right now in the midst of the chaos and the debates that are going on. In the
I think
convention.
my impression is that his highest priority is unity, and I think that is a noble thing. The Scripture calls us to be united, but never at the expense of truth.
And I don't think his mantra would be unity at all costs, but I certainly think that whether intended or not, that his will be unity at some cost.
Right.
So,
All right. All right. Well, appreciate you joining us today. We'll have to have you come back sometime and be with us. And appreciate Pastor J.B. Todd over there on the camera and the soundboard. He helped us to get some things set up so that hopefully we have better mics and so forth. And he and Pastor Jason Victory, they did all of this work for our set, so we appreciate that. But thank you for joining us today. And if you've got any questions about anything that we have said, we will be glad to try to interact with you on that. Just reach out to us. Our website here at Westport is www.westport.church, and you can certainly get a hold of us in that way. Thank you for joining us.